Hi, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who are just joining us, my name is Teralyn Parr, and I'm the director of the Bisexual Research Group, and I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Monica Ghabrial. Monica is a health psychologist whose research has primarily examined stress, health, and resilience among racialized queer and trans people. As a queer first-generation Coptic Egyptian-Canadian, Dr. Ghabrial is especially interested in experiences of conflict, affirmation, and biculturalism among plurisexual people. Through an intersectional, strengths-based framework, she developed and validated the first measure of positive attitude towards identity for racialized queer people, which is called the Queer People of Color Identity Affirmation Scale, and used that scale to investigate the link between identity affirmation and cardiovascular health. In her current position as a CIHR postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Ghabrial is working on a national investigation of trans and non-binary health and healthcare access. She also runs a website dedicated to reporting research on queer and trans health, which is www.queercarekit.com, and we will share that with you shortly. Monica has pre-recorded her talk today, and she will be joining us live for the Q&A portion of the talk. So please bear with me as I share Monica's talk with you all. Okay, enjoy.
I've included my email address and other modes of contact on this slide. Hi, I'm Dr. Monica Ghabrial, and today I'll be speaking to you about the invisibility of plurisexual people of color in science and in everyday life. I'd like to begin by acknowledging this land from which I have the pleasure of speaking to you. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work here. I'll also tell you a little bit about me. So as I said, my name is Monica Ghabrial. You can pronounce that Gabriel or Gabriel, as I know that's a bit easier for people. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a queer, plurisexual, Coptic Egyptian first-generation Canadian. I'm a health psychologist and a CIHR postdoctoral fellow, currently working in epidemiology and biostatistics at Western University. Specifically, I'm working on 2 studies across Canada on trans health. I have my master's degree and Ph.D. in psychology from the University of Toronto. There, I primarily studied stress, health, and resilience among queer and trans people of color. And I did that through qualitative approaches, experimental design, using psychophysiology measures and psychometrics. And it was also during my dissertation that I developed and validated the first measure of identity affirmation among queer and trans people of color, the Queer People of Color Identity Affirmation Scale. I also have other areas of interest and research, including intimate partner violence, housing discrimination, HIV stigma, and of course, bisexuality and plurisexuality. I also run a knowledge translation website for queer and trans health, www.queercarekit.com. I'll also tell you a little bit about my research and the foundations of my research. So psychology research has gradually begun to examine experiences and well-being of queer people of color and trans people of color. However, this body of literature is limited in multiple ways. For one, often people of color are grouped in with white people in regard to analysis and also reporting. Trans people are often grouped in with sexual minority people, and bisexual people are often pooled with monosexual gay and lesbian people. This grouping and treatment of homogenization among this population limits how researchers can examine the unique experiences and outcomes of each of these subpopulations. There's also limited quantitative measures. Prior to my own research, when I developed and validated the Queer People of Color Identity Affirmation Scale, there was only one existing published measure of identity for queer people of color. Otherwise, there are mainly single-axis measures that we use in research, which measure only one category of identity, so sexual identity or ethno-racial identity. Single access measures force queer people of color to separate their intertwined identity categories and sometimes choose between them, which of course limits our ability to understand this identity as a whole. There was also limited strengths-based research, especially in the quantitative literature. Although there's a growing body of qualitative research that's positive with queer people of color and trans people of color, there isn't very much in regard to quantitative research. And quantitative research largely focuses on stress, maladaptive coping, symptomology, HIV, substance use, rather than examining strengths and positive coping. This is likely related to the fact that there are very few measures of positive experiences and positive identity for this population. And this further pathologizes queer and trans people of color and contributes to the general idea in psychology and research that straight and white people are the standard for health and wellness. This lack of quantitative and positive research disadvantages psychologists in terms of having a scientifically informed, comprehensive understanding of queer and trans people of color wellness. Finally, there's little existing research with physiological measures of health and very little positive research in this area. The health research with queer people of color and trans people of color is very minimal and often relies on self-reported measures of general health and again focuses on HIV or substance use. Sexual minority people and ethno-racial minority people may be at increased risk of cardiovascular issues and poor health, and yet this area is sorely lacking for this population. Using my Queer People of Color Identity Affirmation Scale, I've been able to examine the relationship with identity affirmation and cardiovascular health. Today, however, I will be focusing just on research with plurisexuality and invisibility in different domains. So according to Gallup polls over time, we can see that the proportions of people identifying as LGBT is growing. You can see that those numbers are nearly doubling for every generation. And I'm sure everyone attending this conference is aware that the majority of queer people identify as bisexual. As you can see here in this graph, about 57% of people in the most recent Gallup poll identified as bisexual, and there were the rest with other identities such as lesbian and gay. You can also see that there is a small sliver of 4% of people identifying with other identities, and a few of those identities are other plurisexual identities. So for example, pansexual or queer. But again, those people are invisibilized in polls such as these. So the next question is, how many bisexual people have an ethno-racial minority background and how many are white? What is the ethno-racial background breakdown for this population? And that question is a lot harder to answer. We don't have a lot of analyses on this, and that's partially because a lot of our population samples group sexual minority people together. So the existing analyses that we have suggest that bisexual people may be more likely to identify as people of color, whereas lesbian, gay, and heterosexual people may be more likely to identify as white. So the stats tell us that the majority of queer people are plurisexual, and that bisexuals may be more likely to identify as people of color. So then how much research do we have on this key population, and how much do we know about their health outcomes and well-being? So to investigate that question, I conducted a content analysis using data from a recent meta-analysis from Lori Ross et al. That examined mental health disparities between bisexual individuals compared to heterosexual and gay and lesbian people. So to be included in this sample of studies, these publications needed to report bisexual data separate from lesbian, gay, and heterosexual people. They also needed to be published in English, French, or Spanish, and the date range was from 1995 to 2016. So this resulted in a sample of 324 studies. I then extracted information on how many of these studies reported the ethno-racial makeup of their samples, and if they reported on health outcomes for their samples, and which ethno-racial minority backgrounds were included in these samples. So only 70% of these 324 articles actually reported any racial makeup information at all. Of those, there were about 80% that were primarily white, so more than 50% of their sample consisted of white participants. Of these 233 articles that reported racial makeup or mentioned race at all, only 4% included samples that were just people of color. And of those articles that reported race or mentioned their racial makeup of their sample at all, only 10% reported outcomes for bisexual people of color, rather than grouping people of color with white people. So one thing I wondered, and that you might be wondering, is okay, then where were those studies that had a diverse sample finding their participants? What were the other studies missing in terms of recruitment strategies? So I found that studies that had more diverse samples, that involved more than 50% people of color participants, often recruited from queer and trans events and neighborhoods, sex venues, bars, queer and trans community agencies. They used respondent-driven sampling, and they also used flyers. As I said, I also investigated the particular ethno-racial backgrounds that were represented in this research. So I found that many studies included Black, African American, and African Canadian participants. We also had a relatively high representation of studies that referred to people of color as non-white. And there were 56% of studies that included Latinx and Hispanic participants. 44% of studies included Asian participants. Sometimes they specified whether that was East Asian, South Asian, etc., and sometimes they just said Asian. 26% of studies included Native American and Aboriginal participants, and several studies, at about 44%, reported that they had other in terms of ethno-racial minority background for their participants, which, as someone collecting data for content analysis on the ethno-racial minority backgrounds of the sample, leaves a lot of mystery and a lot of questions. So in order to see if things are improving in the literature, are people of color more highly represented than they once were, I ran a multinomial logistic regression, and that revealed that no, in fact, there were no differences. So you can see in this graph that the number of studies that include bisexual people and report bisexual outcomes separately from other sexual minority groups is indeed increasing. But as you can see in the red circle, the proportion of studies that have more than 50% people of color in their sample is not increasing. So of course, this highlights a great need for diverse, intersectional, and inclusive research. Now, of course, measuring sexual orientation is not always cut and dry, and there are many different ways that we can examine sexual orientation. So there are multiple dimensions, specifically through which we measure plurisexuality and bisexuality. Of course, there's just the matter of the sexual orientation identity label. Do you identify as bisexual, pansexual? There are also other dimensions that we as researchers use, such as sexual or romantic behavior and sexual or romantic attraction, and as well as your current day and your history. All these different dimensions and all different timelines that might determine what your sexual orientation is and if you're plurisexual. And of course, we know that bisexual umbrella includes many identities that mean many different things to other people and are based on different gender attractions as well. But sometimes these dimensions don't align. You can be attracted to multiple genders and identify as a lesbian or identify as heterosexual. And so the question is then, how do we accurately measure plurisexuality and bisexuality when sometimes people identify differently than how we might expect them to? Are we only recruiting people who identify as bisexual, in which case we're missing data from people who identify as queer, biromantic, heterosexual, but still have plurisexual tendencies in terms of behavior and attraction, whether in the present day or in their history, which really means that we miss a great large piece of this population's information. And we know that this is a major loss in data in the plurisexual population because some research has already indicated that there are key sociodemographic differences within the plurisexual population between individuals who identify with different labels. So, for example, there are gender differences in plurisexual identity labels. Genderqueer or non-binary people are more likely than cisgender people to identify with a plurisexual identity than with a monosexual identity, and the majority identify as queer, bisexual, or pansexual. Trans women, trans men, and non-binary people are more likely to identify as queer and pansexual, whereas cisgender women and men are more likely to identify as bisexual. There are also key sociodemographic variables. Research from New Zealand tells us that pansexual people are more likely to be younger, politically liberal, and indigenous. And there are, of course, differences in ethno-racial background, as I've said earlier, that plurisexual people or bisexual people may be more likely to be people of color than to be white, compared to lesbian, gay, and heterosexual people. And there is evidence that plurisexual people report more fluidity, mobility, in that their attractions and behaviors change over time. Research also suggests that there are differences within the plurisexual population in regard to mental and behavioral health outcomes. For example, mostly heterosexual people are at increased risk of adverse mental and behavioral health outcomes compared to heterosexual individuals, but are at lower risk than bisexual individuals. People who identify as bisexual experience more anti-plurisexual stigma from lesbian and gay individuals than those who identify as queer or pansexual. Compared to bisexual people, though, pansexual participants report more disclosure of their identity and more discrimination from heterosexuals, as well as greater depression. Bisexual people of color also appear to have higher rates of internalized bi-negativity compared to bisexual white people. So all of this shows us that it is very important to analyze and measure individuals from different subpopulations separately, and that when we pool them, we miss really important information about the differences between these groups in regard to sociodemographics as well as health outcomes. So this is where intersectionality theory can come into play as a really effective tool for research. Intersectionality was first coined by Black feminist scholars to describe the ways that feminism and the legal system were failing to serve people with multiple marginalized identities, especially Black women. This theory is largely employed to understand the ways that multiple systems of oppression put individuals at greater risk of negative health outcomes. This theory can also guide positive, strengths-based research that examines the ways that individuals experience identity cohesion and draw strength from their social location. Through intersectionality in this case, we might ask, how do racism, heterosexism, bi-negativity, sexism, and cissexism interact and mutually construct one another to impact the experiences of plurisexual people of color? Through an intersectional lens, we can see that plurisexual people of color live in oppressed social categories that challenge many notions of gender and sexuality. Bisexuality is judged negatively by many within and outside of the larger queer and trans population, and heterosexuals often fetishize bisexuals, queer and trans people often don't trust or believe them, and plurisexual people of color are at risk of experiencing different contextual forms of discrimination in a variety of different contexts. Common forms of bisexual stigma, as I'm sure that you've heard about throughout this conference and prior to, include promiscuity, indecisiveness, attention-seeking, and trustworthiness. And some research suggests that ethno-racial minority communities might judge bisexuality more negatively than white people as well. And this might be part of why bisexual people of color and plurisexual people of color experience more internalized bi-negativity. Awareness of these stereotypes are also more likely to lead to people not disclosing their identity, not coming out, or identifying as a monosexual identity, such as heterosexual, or as a lesbian, rather than identifying with a plurisexual identity, which of course also increases invisibility. Passing and erasure are prominent themes for plurisexual people of color. Because of hypervigilance and discrimination, passing as straight or cisgender or white becomes very relevant. For plurisexual people, sexual orientation is often visible through the gender of their partner. So for example, if a person is seen with someone who is perceived to be the same gender as them, someone might think that they're monosexual gay. Passing is often viewed as a positive thing because it reduces incidences of discrimination, but it also reduces accesses to similar others and resources, which of course affects mental health. Passing for plurisexual people can also be damaging because it's felt as invisibility and invalidation, and they often find themselves having to come out over and over again, or having to defend or justify identity to others, which of course is made more complex for racialized people. Passing is another phenomenon shared between bisexual individuals and some people of color. Similar to the privilege and burden that bisexual people possess with their ability to pass as heterosexual, many people of color must also navigate passing or performing as either white or as POC, racialized, in order to gain access and acceptance in both realms. Now, it's important to note also that passing is a term and a concept that is potentially problematic, as it positions the person as deceptive and duplicitous and falsely trying to claim membership to socially privileged identities. So I've asked plurisexual people of color to describe their identities and their experiences, and so often this is done through a narrative of invisibility. So what does everyday plurisexual POC invisibility look like? There are many different forms, as it turns out. Plurisexual people of color discuss their identity in regard to outness, visibility, and concealment, not being enough at the intersections of their multiple social categories, feeling like imposters in regard to their relationships, and feelings of betrayal toward their communities. They also describe invisible challenges they have that aren't discussed enough because no one outside of bisexual people or bisexual people of color or plurisexual people of color are aware of these challenges. And they also talk about finding empowerment within their experiences. In my research, many queer people of color and plurisexual people of color specifically are not out to their families. They describe the many reasons that they can't be entirely out in their lives, including threats from families, fear of losing relationships, etc. For example, to describe her mother's views, this person said, "I think she saw an ad on Yahoo News and it was two guys kissing. And she was like, 'Ew, look at my screen.' And I was like, 'What?' And I look at the picture and it's just two guys kissing, and that pissed me off. And I was like, 'You have way too much hatred. What if it was me in the picture with a woman?' And she just looked at me and said, 'Don't ever say that in your life. I will kill you.' And I believe her." In the discussion of the queer and trans pressure to come out, participants and plurisexual and queer people of color generally agreed that this imperative excludes people of color and neglects their safety and comfort. So for example, this person said, "I feel like it isn't really realistic for me or realistic for a lot of people I know that are racialized because our communities are different. I think it's the way that communities react to queerness is very different, regardless of their level or scale of homophobia. Different communities react differently. When the queer and trans community perpetuates the idea that complete outness and full visibility is synonymous with pride and authenticity, this causes many people of color to feel shame or inadequacy, and this was something touched upon by many people I've spoken to. There are so many subpopulations in the queer and trans community who have a common narrative of not being enough. People I've spoken to reported a general lack of belonging in various spaces and the intersection between visibility and invisibility of their ethno-racial identity and the invisibility of their sexual orientation. As I said, a common narrative, especially with plurisexual people of color, is not being enough. White passing and biracial participants also report that the invisibility of their sexual identity interacts with their skin tones to affect belonging. One person says, "The visibility of my racial identity tends to other me from the circles I want to feel welcome in, and it's the same with the invisibility of my queer identity." Another person says, "Not enough, not straight enough, not gay enough, not white enough, not Chinese enough." So a lot of feelings of inadequacy and reports of the complexity of these interactions. And you can see that the first participant notes that they're excluded from the queer and trans spaces due to their ethno-racial identity as well as their plurisexual identity. So they're excluded on, unfortunately, multiple levels. Multiracial and biracial people discuss a common narrative of invisibility across their identity categories and the microaggressions they face and the harm they experience to their well-being. When describing their own attitude toward their identity, this queer, genderqueer, multiracial person said, "As a self-identifying person of color, I often get the reactions, comments that I look straight or look white, and it's really something that I found to be incredibly damaging to my sense of self." I include this quote to emphasize the harm that this invisibility has on self-worth. Romantic relationships also impact visibility and feelings of authenticity. Relationships and partner gender are highly relevant for plurisexual people, as I said earlier, whose sexual orientation is often externally determined and judged based on partner gender, and who experience different discrimination in different contexts from heterosexuals and lesbian and gay people based on their partner's gender. This was especially the case for people involved with cis white people. So, for example, this person said, "I feel that as an East Asian woman who is currently in a monogamous relationship with a white cis man, my queerness and racialization are being questioned because of my perception of how others may be perceiving me. I feel that I am betraying my queerness by not dating a woman. I feel that I am betraying my racialized identity by dating a white person. I feel like an imposter." Experiences of relationships also interact with skin tone for biracial or white passing participants. So, for example, "It hasn't helped that I have much lighter skin than my family, and so I'm not automatically perceived as Latinx, or I'm not currently in a relationship with a man, so I don't fit easily into the LGBTQ+ community. Because of this, I feel like an imposter. This is a challenge for me since I don't see a space for myself to exist. I'm other in every context, it seems." As you can see, another overarching feeling across the study was that of being an imposter and not deserving to claim certain identities and spaces and not having places to belong. There were multiple challenges associated specifically with being a plurisexual person of color. For example, participants said that when going through a divorce or trying to separate from an abusive relationship with a cis man, they weren't able to access necessary support from the queer and trans community because of the composition of their relationship. A particular issue that stood out to me was being unable to explain the stress of a certain cultural gender role expectations to white, queer, and trans peers. This person describes that. "Specifically for South Asians, the idea of honor is big. I can't do anything to dishonor the family to keep me from getting married to an eligible bachelor. It's shitty that I have to pretend to be a perfect daughter for the suitor when I just want to have a choice. I don't like telling people about this because I'm bi, so I'm afraid people will think that I'm complaining for no reason. I could easily marry a dude, and one that my parents would like." For this participant, they're isolated with this stress from their family. They understand the limited regard that monosexual people have for bisexuality as a sexual minority identity, and they even show evidence of diminishing the importance of their own problem as a result, and of course invisibilizing this stress in their community by not sharing it with their peers. In other instances, people reported positive experiences of their invisibility. They viewed their passing and contextual visibility as empowering and powerful. This participant has a great example of that. "Being a Black queer woman is important to me because I face unique difficulties. Being a femme woman is also unique. I don't look gay until I open my mouth. I'm a chameleon who can blend in if I want to, a privilege that isn't my doing, nor is it something that I can use at will, and a snake who changes many skins. I am powerful. Something of interest to me in this quote is the fact that bisexuals are often negatively viewed as sneaky and duplicitous and snake-like, but this particular person uses that similar language in a positive light and redefines that sneakiness as mobility that enables them to enter different contexts and be seen differently in different places. Plurisexual people of color also report that they use their invisibility and passing as a tool to advocate for their community. This person said, I see them, their invisible or visible identity categories, as beneficial when I'm advocating on racial justice or LGBTQ issues because I pass in white or cis-hetero spaces. And not that I think people who straddle multiple identities should have to be spokespeople or bridge builders, but I think it's my responsibility to leverage my privilege. This person's positionality made them more compassionate, and their passing enabled them to support and advocate for their community. So again, they reframed their passing as a tool for community advocacy, despite the possible stress that they experienced as a result. It's also important to note here that passing exposes people to the bigotry of others who might see them as insiders, which is another reason that passing is inaccurately labeled as a privilege and a positive experience. So overall, I've found that relationships with white cisgender people might be a potential source of stress, invisibility, and self-invalidation. These relationships can cause stressful feelings of betrayal and inauthenticity, and these relationships appear to cause further doubt in queer and ethno-racial identity and feelings of isolation and duplicity for plurisexual people of color. Romantic and sexual relationships in regard to gender, race, and sexuality are complex and might have a strong influence on stress and well-being among plurisexual people of color. More research is needed that investigates the effect of not only partner gender, but also partner ethno-racial background, as that can influence mental health as well. And future research should also explore how we cope with those feelings of betrayal and how individuals navigate their relationships and different strategies that they use to create invisibility when they need to in those relationships. My findings also present unique positive perspectives on invisibility among plurisexual people of color. Although stigma concealment appears to psychologically be damaging for queer and trans people, it's possible that reframing the act of stigma concealment as a mean for queer and trans activism might mitigate the harmful impact on mental health. These findings might thus contribute to the strengths-based literature for this population and definitely beg further investigation. However, despite these positive narratives, it's important to note that plurisexual people of color often use negative language when describing themselves, such as being imposters or being traitors, and overall they report not being enough and not being deserving or worthy of spaces and identities. There's evidence that visibility is linked to identity and a sense of self-worth. So research and community work is needed to create bi-visibility and validation for the well-being of plurisexual people of color. Overall, there's a great need for an increase in intersectional research with plurisexual people of all genders and various ethno-racial backgrounds that examines the complexities of this population and separates them into different analytical categories, rather than grouping everyone together under one umbrella or only recruiting and measuring bisexual experience. In the content analysis that I presented earlier, I was only able to examine data for cisgender bisexual people of color. But what about other plurisexual populations and plurisexuals with diverse genders? There's also a need for strengths-based research that doesn't pathologize this population, but rather examines the positives of living with this identity. Queer and trans people of color in general experience positive aspects of their identity and lived experience, and can have physical health that is as good as or better than that of white, queer, and trans people. And this has been evidenced in bisexual specific research as well. There is data that suggests that bisexual people of color exhibit good health that is comparable with straight and gay or lesbian people of color. This is evidence that our population is resilient and can thrive in the face of oppression and adversity, and that there may be unexamined protective factors. There's a great deal of intersectional research to be done in terms of exploring these positive factors and health, and I hope that the folks attending this conference are up to the task of continuing these efforts. Going forward, I urge researchers to examine diversity within the plurisexual population and measure subpopulations separately in order to more fully understand our differences and foster visibility for the plurisexual population. If anyone has any questions or would like to chat about this research further, please feel welcome to contact me. I've included my email address and other modes of contact on this slide. I've also included some of my publications that I reference throughout this presentation in case anyone would like to read about that research further. Thank you so much to all of you for attending this talk, and thank you to the International Bisexuality Research Conference team for inviting me and for organizing this entire event. Happy Bisexual Awareness Week to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for a terrific presentation. Your work really does make an important contribution to the literature. Bear with me for one moment. I just want to make sure that we have Monica with us here. Great. Hi, Monica.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We have a couple of questions, but again, thank you again. That was great. And I know personally, when I was doing research for my dissertation, your article that you referenced, that we can shape shift and build bridges, it was one of the very few that I could find that did focus exclusively on the experiences of visibility and invisibility by people of color. So thank you for that. So our first question is asking, how common is using the term plurisexual in academia? So does using plurisexual rather than bi actively stop people from finding their community and improving their health? And I guess the follow-up is that no one is Googling plurisexual groups to support, and does that make it more difficult for community building and finding connections?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. And thank you so much for this question. It is a really great point. This language is something that, we struggle with as researchers because we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. And bisexuality or bisexual as a term doesn't relate to a lot of people and doesn't feel fitting for a lot of people. And by just using bisexual, we worry about invisibilizing pansexual people, queer folks, other people in that umbrella who don't identify as bisexual. So this is a challenge that we have. Plurisexual is, and Taryn, you probably have seen this as well, plurisexual is growing as a term. I'm currently working on a review of research on that topic, and we do use plurisexual as much as we can when applicable to be more all-encompassing. But this is I believe the question asker is saying that this is a limitation and that it's difficult for community members and non-researchers to access that research. And so I would say that bisexual is still likely used in the articles and used as keywords in the articles in order to be more reachable, but that is definitely something for us to keep in mind. And still with knowledge translation efforts, in terms of maybe we publish an academic article and we use the term plurisexual, and that's something that researchers can read together. But then it's important to translate that knowledge for the community, for folks, and use terms that aren't just accessible to researchers and are more accessible to community members and people at the ground floor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly is a more common term. Dr. Rosie Nelson also used it in their work earlier today, which definitely has some intersections with yours, with regards to privilege and passing. So our next question is, what statistical tools and analyses are your favorites for human subjects research?
Statistical tools and analyses. I would say in this world, qualitative analysis is still my favorite, working on that particular paper that you just mentioned, the Shapeshift and Build Bridges paper, I don't think that I could have accessed information of that depth with quantitative data analysis. It's interesting because that particular paper and that data, it felt like it was accessing very deep feelings, and I was able to collect this novel perspectives from folks. But it was actually an online survey. So it wasn't even with interviews, and online surveys generally don't access information that is so complex and so deep in it. So it shows you that our population, many people are very eager to be seen and to share our perspectives. And when I do work with queer and trans people of color, people generally are like, thank you for asking me. And thank you also for asking me positive things. People want to talk about their positive experiences too. And it also shows that you can, if you are limited in terms of doing interviews or being able to reach folks of particular specific populations for one-on-one interviews, that you might be able to use online data collection as well.
Great, thank you. And that actually leads really well into the next question. So you spoke about different recruitment locations, and you also spoke about basically expanding, the use of terminology like plurisexual to include other identities under that umbrella. You have a captive audience of researchers here. Do you have any other, advice or recommendations for recruitment when it comes to, finding these communities that are often invisible?
I will say that I have not really struggled to find queer and trans and plurisexual people of color in my research. And whenever I do come across articles where, it's primarily white and, we just couldn't find anyone who was an ethnic or racial minority, I raise my eyebrow a little bit, because I think that it's not that hard in a lot of ways, especially particularly with online research. I think depending on your geographic location, of course, that can be challenging. But in recruitment strategies, I think using broad language and using language that you have determined to be relatable for the population you're working with. Some people don't identify as people of color, even if you would identify them as that. So trying to learn more about the community you're working with, I often use ethnic racial minority because some people find person of color to be more political than they wish to identify with. So learning about your population and learning about the language that they want to use. And when it comes to collecting broader and more diverse samples with plurisexual people, again, I would caution against just using the term bisexual, but this is such a diverse population that you might be excluding certain people no matter what words you use. So I think pilot testing the language that you're using, if you have the resources to do that with the sample and the population that you're looking to work with, would also be really helpful, because it will always vary depending on where you're at and who you're working with.
Thank you so much for that. So the next question, and I know you spoke a little bit about this at the beginning, but can you talk a little bit more about Queer Care Kit and the importance of thinking about the minority stress model from an intersectional perspective?
Sure, Queer Care Kit. Yes, so that was a CIHR funded project that I worked on with my colleague, Dr. Natanya Marcus. And this was years in the making, when we collected as much peer-reviewed research as we could on queer and trans health. And we tried to write that in a way, it's tricky when you're an academic and you're used to academic writing. And we tried to write that in a way that would hopefully be more accessible to folks. We also really wanted that to be accessible to healthcare providers, teaching the community alone about the struggles that we face and the barriers we face in healthcare isn't enough, of course. It's important to reach the healthcare providers and people who are affecting these systems more directly. And you asked a second question.
The importance of the minority stress model from an intersectional perspective.
Right. Well, the minority stress model is limited in its own way. There are factors that it doesn't touch on, especially with related to plurisexual people. There isn't mention of anti-plurisexual stigma in the minority stress model. So researchers now are looking at modifying that a little bit and tweaking it and adding and creating new models based on the minority stress model. Within an intersectional perspective, I think intersectionality is incredibly powerful, and it's become a bit of a buzzword. And I think people are losing touch with what it means. And what we say in the school of intersectional thought is, if you're not talking about power, then you're not talking about intersectionality. If you're just talking about two people interacting with each other and maybe they have diverse identities and you're calling that intersectional, that's not what that means. You need to also be looking at the systems of power that are at play and how they are mutually constructing. How do they affect one another in different contexts? What's the difference between racism and sexism and racialized sexism, and how each of these are dynamic and change over time and interact with each other differently over time. So it is so much more than what a lot of people think it is. And I would refer to Patricia Collins, and a recent publication by Collins and Bilge from 2021 that is all about use of intersectionality in research, if people wish to read more about that.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And one of our earlier keynotes, Dr. Zori Paul, her work looks at bi+, women of color, and mental health. And one of the things that Zori talked about was, the idea of micro affirmations and building collective self-esteem as a bi community. And I'm wondering if, in any of the stories from your participants that were, I guess, more around, the empowering things that they took from, their ability to be chameleon-like or to switch skins like a snake. I'm wondering if those themes of macro affirmations or collective self-esteem came up at all. Or just generally what your thoughts are on, those concepts in relation to bi people of color and the importance to mental health.
Right. First of all, yes, I'm a huge fan of that recent work by Dr. Paul. That's fantastic. And I love to see that they are developing a scale, I believe, or have developed a scale specifically for bisexual women of color. Yes, the affirmations piece, I have a lot of thoughts on general affirmations. I'll speak to my own research findings because that is what I will hopefully be less inaccurate about rather than speaking about someone else's work. But a lot of the affirmations that we have in our population, I find, are based in, and a lot of what we talk about and what I've talked about in my work and what my own scale is based on, are affirmations based on negative things that have happened to us. And I do feel complicated about that. And I hope that researchers can start, including myself, can kind of evolve and look more about affirmations that also come from positive experiences. So in the scale that I developed, there are positive attitudes toward one's identity in terms of just, I feel good about myself. My identity categories are compatible and empower me. But there are also ways that we have affirmations that are, I am stronger because of the bad things that have happened to me. And I hope that we can continue to develop research that isn't just based on the bad things that have happened to us when we are developing these kinds of measures and when we are talking about positive things, because of course we are so much more than the bad things that might have happened to us and the barriers that we face, especially as we begin to dismantle these barriers and flourish and thrive. So I don't know if that answered your question in regard to affirmations.
No, I think that's great.
I do see a mix, I guess, to answer your question maybe more directly. I do see a mix of different kinds of affirmations. Some of them are these struggles and challenges based affirmations, but it is really wonderful to see not just I'm stronger because I hide myself to advocate for my community, but also I live a beautiful life and I experience joy with my community.
Nice. Yeah, lots of cheers coming from the audience, comments that this is so necessary. and Dr. Zori Paul saying that in agreement aligns what she too found for microaffirmation. So great. Thank you so much for being with us, Monica. I know that you have a very hectic schedule and you are traveling right now. I think that I can say for all of us that this was a really valuable session. And again, thank you for your insights and sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for these amazing questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you in our next session.